Throughout this program, I've been arguing that management is responsible for quality and productivity improvement, not the employees. That's what we're paid for. And the way to achieve that is through fostering organizational integration, by worrying about how can we link this beast together at every level, from the top all the way down to the bottom. There's lots of good data, lots of research to show that organizations that are tight, that are focused, that are well managed, perform better in the marketplace. Let's spend a minute talking about what happens if you don't worry about organizational integration. A few years ago, a famous financier checked into a hotel in Milwaukee, Wisconsin. It was a very exciting day for the personnel within that hotel. This fellow was known throughout the world. They weren't going to let a clerk greet him. They sent an assistant manager down who waited all afternoon for the famous financier to arrive. They had fruit, they had flowers. Everybody was breathless with anticipation. And about 3 o'clock in the afternoon, he finally swept in the front door. The assistant manager was ready. He said, "Good afternoon, sir. Thank you for staying at our meager hotel. Please sign in." Well, you know how it is when you sign in at a hotel chain. They give you some options about how do you plan to pay for your hotel room. The financier filled out the whole form except he left that section blank. He reached into his pocket, took out his own bank's credit card, which they had just introduced, and said, "I'll pay with this." The assistant manager looked at the form, looked at the card, and he said, "I'm sorry, sir, but we don't honor that card. You see, it's not printed here on the form." The financier refused to pay with any other form of payment. Now the assistant manager had a real decision to make. He looked at the financier, he looked at the form, he looked at the card, and finally he made his decision. He refused to let the financier register. The financier didn't argue at all. He walked back into the lobby, put a dime in the phone booth, and he called the president of the conglomerate that owned the hotel chain, Collect. As it turns out, the president of the conglomerate wasn't in New York City, where the headquarters was. He was in Brussels, Belgium. He woke up the president in the middle of the night in Brussels, Belgium, and he said, "What the hell kind of an operation are you running here anyway?" The president of the conglomerate woke up and he said, "Who is this?" "My favorite banker." "Where are you, my friend?" "Milan, Mallorca." "Milwaukee." 2 minutes later, the phone rang in Milwaukee in the office of the manager. The manager burst out of his office as if he was shot out of a cannon, knocked over the assistant manager, ran into the lobby, threw himself at the feet of the financier. The financier stepped on him and went to his room. The whole thing took about 12 minutes and 12,000 miles. The president of the hotel chain and I were talking about this incident because he used it as an example of how lousy junior management was today. And I asked him a question that I find myself often asking executives. What did you do to him that would make him act like that? And then you find out. The hotel chain had a policy, and the policy was that every block must be checked off or management would kill them. That kid couldn't make any other decision. He wasn't really part of management. He couldn't look across the counter at this famous financier and say to himself, is he going to skip out on his hotel room? I know what some of you are thinking. Maybe. 50-50 chance. But then make a real management decision in spite of that. And the decision ought to be, even if he does, we better pick up the tab on this guy. We, the manager, the conglomerate president, we are all in this together. Organizations that don't foster every level of management worrying about integration fly apart. For example, instead of looking at an organization in the classical kind of way, look at it this way. People spin at different speeds in organizations. Small wonder we don't see the world the same way. Small wonder it's so hard to keep us all together. In organizations that produce something, for example, in manufacturing, the production plant, in a hospital, in radiology, there are places where they process work on a regular basis. Go to the person in charge of that, ask him or her, what is your idea of heaven? And somebody who makes something for a living every day, their eyes will mist up and they'll say, heaven would be one type, one color, one fabric of whatever they're making. They want to spin at 5 RPM. They want to grind out these things like a giant flywheel. Leave me alone and I can make 1 million of them by January. Then you go to the other parts of the same organization and people have to sell or market what's being manufactured. They live in a totally different world. Ask them what's their idea of heaven and their eyes will mist up. Only they'll say heaven would be every size, every color, every fabric. They want to spin at 500 RPM. And lastly, if you go to the headquarters, to where people watch the people who make and sell, administration, they spin at 0. At least that's what these people will tell you. Now, the object is not to make everybody spin at 250. The object is to let them spin at the speeds they have to spin at to be effective. Salespeople live in a different world than production people. But how do you keep them together? How do you prevent them from bursting apart? The way you do that is to worry about organizational integration. Again, at every level. Take a look at the classic table of organization. Remember what happens when you plug human beings into 20th century organizations. We don't fit very well. People start at the bottom and they look to the left and they look to the right and they see 2 or 3 other people in their department. They want to be good, they want to do well, they work hard, they come early, they stay late, they perform, and they enter into management. Now as they go up the pyramid, they look to the left and they look to the right, there are fewer people. And as they move their way forward, the numbers get smaller and smaller, but each time they're waving the flag of their department. Excelsior, they ride off into the budget meeting because they're going to be the best department chairman or head that they've ever had. And if that particular department used to get 26% of the operating budget, this year they're going to get 55%, whether the organization needs it or not. That's sub-optimization. That goes on in every organization, certainly that I work in. Management has to work against those dynamics. One way of working against those dynamics is to get management out of their offices, to get management to manage by wandering around, to get out there and constantly reinforce the idea that management is not separate and distinct from the rest of the organization. And when you're out there wandering around, remember, your job is to constantly reinforce what's getting in the way. How can we help you? What's getting in the way of your quality and your productivity? Managers have got to take the initiative and constantly hold confrontation meetings. A confrontation meeting is a period of time reserved to discover or look at not what do we do, you do that every day, but how you do what you do. When you bring your folks together and ask 2 questions, what's wrong and how can we fix it? Build it into the way you manage and constantly repeat that, great things can happen. For example, one company president who makes blue jeans stopped me after a seminar and he said, I think I need to have a confrontation meeting. And I said, why? He said, because we're going to lose $500,000 in the first quarter of next year. And he proceeded to outline all the problems that he had in his organization, how a third of their products were being rejected by their quality control department, how they had 128% turnover rate in one of their plants. 128% turnover rate. Do you know what that means? It means people come in at 8, they leave at 9:30. He couldn't keep people in the plant. He listed all of the problems that were getting in the way of the profitability of his company. That's a rich menu for a confrontation meeting. He gathered 60 managers together in a hotel, 60 people who'd never been in the same room together, broke them into teams and talked about what's wrong. Why aren't we being productive? Why is our quality so lousy? They had lots of reasons, lots of good examples for what was wrong, but then he broke them into new teams in this classic confrontation meeting, problem solving with his own people, and said, well, what are we going to do about it? Every team came back with a different kind of suggestion. Each one was focusing on the organization or on the processes or the communication systems. By the end of 3 days, they had totally ripped that company apart and put it back together again. By the end of the first quarter of the next business year, instead of a $500,000 loss, his company made a $750,000 profit. Participative management really does pay off. In another organization, we were training employees in an employee involvement program at the very lowest level of the organization to come together weekly to work on problem solving, to ask themselves 2 questions. What's wrong and how can we fix it? We trained union employees in a warehouse in a series of problem-solving steps. And then we said, what problems do you want to now attack now that you know the skills of problem solving? The group got together and decided the first problem they wanted to work on was the problem of breakage in the warehouse. So they, with their infinite wisdom, after being trained by my company, they finally decided that if they stopped putting the heavy boxes on top, they could reduce breakage and save $50,000 a year. And they did. Over a 9-month period, that company has saved $600,000 simply by bringing problem solving and decision making and responsibility all the way down through the organization to the bottom. At every level, people are worried about quality, productivity, and improving the way things are done. If we all did that, we would end up with an integrated organization. If we all did that, we would be forging relationships with the people who work for us. Ultimately, what you're trying to do is establish a climate where everybody's head is pointed in the same direction, where we all share the same values about excellence, about being the best we could possibly be. The concept of climate is one of the most difficult things for people like me to teach students. They've never worked for a living. They really can't relate to the idea that climate and in creating a positive work climate is perhaps management's fundamental responsibility. So the way I teach it to my students is every year I say what I just said. And I say something to the effect that management has to be an environmental creator. In one of my undergraduate courses, I teach 300 students. So inevitably, when I start that management has to be an environmental creator business, I hit the podium, which means it's going to be on the final. 300 heads go down, 300 pencils go up, and you can almost hear their minds writing environmental creator. As their heads are down and their pencils are moving, I point my finger to the back of the room, and I usually bellow into the microphone, "If you two folks in the back of the room can't shut up, get out of my class." 2 people in the back of the room go into cardiac arrest. 298 other pencils are frozen. 300 people breathe, but not for a couple of seconds they don't. And there is absolutely silence in that room. This is showbiz, it's not scholarship. But I've got them. Because in the silence, I can whisper to them, what's changed? What's changed in this room? A minute before you're loose and learning, and now you're all frozen solid. I created that climate, the positive climate and the negative climate. Like you, I can't learn for my students. I can't write in their notebooks for them. I can't do their work for them. What I have to work on is creating a climate that fosters them coming to work, enjoying it, getting something out of it. Indeed, when you think about management, that's all any of us can do. Build relationships and build climate. So as you look back on this whole program where we've talked about human behavior and individual and interpersonal skills, and the necessity of managers thinking about groups and group dynamics, and how we got to apply techniques of management to link groups together throughout the entire organization, we're really talking about creating an effective organization. I'm on the board of trustees of a medical center in Boston. And as often happens in trustee meetings, department heads come and make presentations to the board. Recently, the director of nurses came in and was making a presentation, and she was explaining how all of the nurses in the hospital were being trained in cardiopulmonary resuscitation. One of the doctors on the board said, "What a waste of time." And we all stopped and said, "Why?" He said, "Because we have specialists in the hospital. We don't have to train all the nurses to do that. We have expert doctors who can do that." And the director of nurses said, "Wait a minute. I don't want one of my nurses to find a patient in cardiopulmonary distress and then stand there wringing her hands saying, 'Oh, woe is me. When will the experts arrive?'" And I thought at the time, that's it. That's what we're really trying to say in this program. We want every manager, indeed every employee, to not wring their hands and say, "Oh, when will management arrive to solve this problem for me?" We want to prepare everyone to be able to solve operational and quality and productivity problems themselves as they come up. When they do that, organizations can truly perform.